whenever we're talking about the population and its characteristics, we talk about different measures, especially the measures of morbidity. In this module, we will be talking about incidence, prevalence, incidence ratio, incidence rate, and different other measures. Morbidity has been defined as any departure, subjective, objective, from a state of psychological, physiological well-being. In practice, morbidity encompasses disease, injury, and disability, and number of persons who are ill. Measures of morbidity frequency characterize the number of persons in a population who become ill. And it talks about the new cases, which are called incidents, or are ill at a given time. It talks about all the individuals which are already ill, and they are not the new cases, which is called prevalence. We will be talking about these different measures. It could be incidence proportion, which is also known as attack rate or a risk, incident rate, or person time rate. There will be point prevalence and period prevalence. All these measures will have different numerator and denominators. The first thing that we want to talk about is incidence, which refers to the occurrence of new cases in a population. These new cases are of any disease or an injury. Although some epidemiologists use incidence to mean the number of new cases in a community, whereas other uses incidence to mean the number of new cases per unit in the population. There are two different kinds of incidence which are commonly measured. The first is incidence proportion, and the other is incidence rate. Incidence proportion is the proportion of the initially disease-free population that developed disease, becomes injured, or died during the specific period of time. Whereas this incidence proportion is a proportion because the person is the numerator. Those who develop disease are all included in the denominator as well. So incidence proportion or risk is given by this formula. And you might notice that the people who are identified in the numerator are the same people who are identified in the denominator. And this is the reason we call it incidence proportion. Let's take an example. That in a study of diabetes, 100 of the 189 diabetic men died during the 13-year follow-up period. To calculate the incidence proportion out of it, the numerator will be 100 deaths among the diabetic men because these are the new cases which emerged, whereas the denominator is 189 diabetic men. This 189 also include all the 100 which are diabetic. Therefore, the risk turned out to be 100 divided by 189, which is 0.529. And when you multiply it by 100, it will be 52.9%. Another example is an outbreak of gastroenteritis among attendees of a corporate picnic. 99 persons ate potato salad, 30 of whom developed gastroenteritis. To calculate the risk of getting the gastroenteritis among the people who actually ate the potato salad, we will use incidence proportion, where the numerator will be those who actually encountered gastroenteritis, and which is the 30 persons. And overall, there are 99 persons. Hence, the risk, which is also called food-specific attack rate, turned out to be 30.3% among those who actually ate the potato salad. There are few properties of incidence proportion. The probability of developing the disease during the specified period. It also includes only new cases of the disease. The denominator is the number of persons in the population at the start of the observation period. And moreover, as I said it earlier, a risk is also a proportion because of the same individual counted in the denominator and the numerator as well. The other measure is incidence rate. Incidence rate or person-time rate is a measure of incidence that incorporates time directly into the denominator. And this is how it's different from the incidence proportion. Whereas a person-time rate is generally calculated by a long-term cohort follow-up studies. Typically, each person is observed from an established starting time until any of these events occur. And those events include onset of the disease, it could be the death, it could be the migration out of the study, or the end of the study. Similar to the incidence proportion, the numerator will stay the same, which counts for all the new cases of the disease, but the denominator here will differ. Like an example, in 2003, 44,232 new cases of acquired immunodeficiency syndrome were reported in the United States. The estimated mid-year population of the US in 2003 was approximately 300 million. If we have to calculate the incidence rate out of this population, the numerator will be 44,232 and the denominator will be 290 million. Whereas, you might notice this 10 raised to the power n. It always depends if we want to keep it 1,000 or 100,000 or even million. Larger the population will be, this value could be larger. Hence, the incidence rate for this population will be 15.21 new cases. And the way we interpret it will be that in the United States, in 2003, there were 15.21 new cases of AIDS per 100,000 population. There are a few properties and uses of incidence rate. And incidence rates describe how quickly disease occurs in the population. Because person time is calculated for each subject, it can accommodate person coming in and out of the study. The denominator accounts for study participants who are lost to follow-up or who die during the study period. Moreover, if we talk about the person time, then person time has one important drawback. Person time assumes that the probability of disease during the study period is constant, which is not usually the case. Long-term cohort studies of the type described here are not very common. Finally, let me add that if we report the incidence rate of, say, one of the study, that's a heart disease study, as 2.5 per 1,000 person year, an epidemiologist may understand this. But the other people who are considered to be the expert, they might not understand it well. Or even a layman won't understand it well. So it's always good to replace the person years as with the persons per year. So it could be 2.5 persons per 1,000 persons per year will make it more sense. Thank you.